Hey everyone, I hope you're all doing well. Today I wanted to give a go at ranking all of the villains from Baldur's Gate 3. Baldur's Gate 3 is home to a cast of incredibly well written and intriguing villains, and I know that every person's list is going to be a bit different, so of course this ranking is all my own opinion. I do think that all the villains in the game have their own unique utility and provide something impactful to the overall journey in Baldur's Gate 3 in some way. Of course, you're free to disagree, and I'd honestly love to hear all of your lists down below. Also quickly, if you enjoy this type of content, please consider subbing to the channel and dropping a like, and without further ado, let's get right into it. At the number 12 spot as the quote worst villain on this list, it's Sarevok. Of course, he plays an extremely minor role within Baldur's Gate 3, as it's less about being a grand revival of a villain from the original Baldur's Gate games and more of a well-integrated cameo of a villain who once stood as the apex threat. Now his old mystical power and position has shrunk down to hiding in the shadows of Baal, and his inclusion in the game is more of a check-in and connection to the original game's lore rather than anything substantial in itself. But even so, Sarevok is extremely fascinating to interact with in his little screen time, especially if you bring characters like Jaheira, who fought and battled with him a century ago in your confrontation. Sarevok has this aged menace in his voice, and an eerie calm which he welcomes death itself. It always feels like he's completely aware of his greater irrelevance to the narrative at hand, and his legacy is very much passed down through the villainy of his granddaughter Orin. Unlike many other villains in this list, Sarevok no longer burns with the ambition or fury he had in the original games, but he's more suited to being a connection of lore and a nod to the history of Baldur's Gate as a whole. His combat encounter is a fun and somewhat difficult one, and his inclusion in the game at all is definitely an awesome way to connect Baldur's Gate 3 to the games that came before it. This one continues with the trend of the last entry with Viconia, one of the more evil companions in Baldur's Gate 1, who's a villain here in the form of her benevolent brainwashing and connection to Shadowheart. Much like Sarevok, Viconia speaks with an aging menace and history, and her role in Baldur's Gate 3 is very much more of a vehicle for Shadowheart's development rather than a true villain in her own right. By the time you finally face Viconia in the midst of Act 3 as the climax of Shadowheart's entire character arc, she's been built up as the Sharan High Priestess, who is cold and devout to the very end. But most of her development here is through the words of Shadowheart throughout the game, and we don't get much of a window into her ideology beyond pure fanaticism, yet I think that's the entire point. She's supposed to be this symbol of a devout to the end follower of Shah who serves as Shadowheart's final obstacle to true change and freedom. She's also a warning of what Shadowheart would have become if you let her kill the Night Song and fall down the path of darkness as a completely obedient and blind follower of Shah. The boss fight with Viconia is also among one of the most difficult in the entire game, and the resolution is one I found pretty satisfying as well. You'll be given the choice to either kill or spare her, a moment that becomes the final mark on Shadowheart's transformation into her own person. In that sense, Viconia functions less as a grand antagonist, but more as a powerful cameo and symbolic final test for our companion. There's just something undeniably entertaining about Mizora as a villain. She slithers herself into every scene with a smirk and accompanying threat, and a lingering mystery surrounding her motives that always keeps you on edge. As Will's patron and a devil in her own right, Mizora is one of the most memorable characters in the game. But personally, I felt like her actual involvement never truly evolves beyond theatrics and sly threats. Of course, you'll mostly find Mizora teasing Will and manipulating whatever strings she can from the sidelines. This is intriguing at first, but when you interact with many of the more impactful villains on this list, Mizora begins to feel like a devil with wasted potential. It feels like she was set up with a much more interesting resolution, but unfortunately, I never felt like the loose end was tied in regard to her arc. If you do decide to outdo her by breaking the pact and then saving Will's father anyway, she won't do much more than scorn Will, and other than her interactions with Will, she doesn't really have much impact on your playthrough as a whole. I personally would have loved to see if there was some way to confront her in a boss fight, or for there to be more consequences for Will breaking the pact and then disobeying her thereafter. So although Mizora is still a great antagonistic character in her own right, she's really just a devilish bystander whose only actual importance is in her connection to our companion Will. Auntie Ethel finds herself at the number 9 spot on this list, and for very good reason. She's definitely one of the more unsettling villains in this list, and while she makes her first impression on you all the way in Act 1, she's one of few characters who has a side quest in Act 3 as well. I was quite surprised in my initial playthrough when I stumbled upon her, hiding in the Blushing Mermaid, where she's on the hunt for a new group of hag survivors. This continuation of her arc adds weight to her as a villain, as she's not just a one-off freak you encounter in a swamp and then never see again, but she continues to find victims all throughout your journey. What makes Ethel truly stand out though is the combination of her initial charm when you initially encounter her in disguise, and then her later cruelty and unpredictability. Whether she's in the midst of consistently manipulating Marina or threatening you with the death of the child she carries, she serves to be one of the most well-performed and grotesque villains in the entire game. The only reason for me why she can't rank much higher is that despite her strong presence in her own quests, her story feels somewhat disconnected from the larger narrative at hand, and her boss fight was quite easy and simple both in Act 1 and Act 3. It definitely feels like she was supposed to play a larger part initially, and this is confirmed by cut content suggesting a grander 3-act hag quest. However, even as it stands, Auntie Ethel remains as a terrifying presence that lingers long after, and one that's impossible to forget. Our next entry is the most powerful vampire of them all, Cazador. You will hear of Cazador and his traumatic impact on Astarion's life and upbringing, and when you finally meet him at the climax of Astarion's quest, he really makes an impression. As a vampire master, Cazador is exactly what you think he'd be, a grotesque blend of aristocratic vanity and pure cruelty. He's evidently been pulling the strings on Astarion's suffering for centuries, and this history makes the final confrontation with him loaded with tension. Even taking a step back for a minute, the entirety of his palace is eerie and is easily one of the most atmospheric locations in the entire game. From the chilling idea of his ascension ritual to the hundreds of thralls that he imprisons, Cazador is for sure one of the most disturbing villains in this list. The only reason I wouldn't rank him higher is that beyond this small sequence, Cazador's impact is fairly isolated. His death or survival doesn't truly impact the larger world at hand, rather just the contained world of the vampires and the spawn within this palace. However, his writing is strong, and his performance truly sells the arrogance and entitlement of his character. Another thing I really enjoyed in relation to Cazador was his boss fight, as I enjoyed the unique mechanics of trying to stop his ascension while also fighting his servants, and it was for sure one of the most memorable fights in the game. Overall, Cazador definitely earns his spot on this list by being one of the more detestable villains Baldur's Gate 3 has to offer. Vlaakith is one of the most elusive villains in Baldur's Gate 3, and despite lacking significant screen time, Vlaakith makes up for it with her menacing performance. First introduced in the Mountain Pass in Baldur's Gate 3, Vlaakith projects herself before your party with demands from the get-go, asking you to execute the mysterious figure within the astral prism. It was from this very moment that Vlaakith's cunning and godlike persona is on full display. If you refuse her, she'll kill you and your party instantly, leading to one of the game's very few game over instances. I actually did this in my first playthrough, and it quickly cemented to me the sort of presence that Vlaakith expects and selfishly demands. But it's through the arc of Lae'zel that Vlaakith's legacy is truly explored, as Lae'zel's entire worldview is shaken by the revelation that her revered goddess is actually a tyrant and usurper. Vlaakith only wants one thing from you constantly throughout the game, and that is to obey her command to kill Orpheus with a twisted promise to make Lae'zel her chosen. Vlaakith's role in the game can culminate in one of two endings, and that's either Lae'zel finding out the truth and being the front of a Githyanki rebellion, or staying blindly loyal. The latter ending, to me, encapsulates the most villainous aspects of Vlaakith. The so-called ascension she promises to Lae'zel results in a devouring of her soul in a twisted ceremony that's one of the most shocking endings for any companion in the game. So although Vlaakith may not always be the most visible villain in the game, there are only few as terrifying as her in concept. Landing in the middle of the list is the Absolute itself, who often feels more like a looming idea than an actual villain. The Absolute is one of the most intriguing villains in this list, as it's more of a prophecy and built-up god worshipped by armies of fanatics rather than an actual tangible villain like most of the others in this list. But of course, the Absolute is no god at all. It's an elder brain corrupted and enhanced through the combined power of the three Netherstones, turning into a psionic entity with its own will and desires. The entire concept of the Absolute is fascinating to me. Throughout the game, it builds a false religion around itself and concurrently manipulates the Chosen Three into empowering it, while also using the illusion of its own divinity to draw thousands to its wicked cause. While the Absolute may not have much of its own personality, the mention of its name consistently through all three acts of the game and its big reveal about it pulling the strings this entire time gives it true weight in the narrative. However, again for me, what holds it back even in the game's final act is that it doesn't really get a chance to speak for itself, and it's much more of an idea than a character in its own right. Despite this, the final boss fight with it at the very climax of the game is epic in scale, and although it may not have the emotional strings of some other encounters in this list, the Absolute still holds its own. It's a fantastic villain thematically, and through its devoted followers in the first two acts of the game, cements itself as a threat that you keep your eye on from the very start. There's something immediately fascinating about Enver Gortash. From the moment you see him, he's charismatic, sharp-witted, and dresses like a Final Fantasy villain. There's a real sense of gravitas to him, as he isn't snarling at you or dribbling with blood, but instead he emanates this distinctly calm and composed persona. However, personally, I think that Gortash ends up being the least compelling of the chosen three. That's not for a lack of great writing, however, as Gortash is easily one of the most cunning and manipulative villains in this list. He's able to invent the Steel Watch and become the Archduke of Baldur's Gate, all while secretly serving the desires of the Absolute. Gortash is constantly reminding you in Act 3 that he's the one that's pulling the strings, and that he wields power that we will never understand, which truly makes him feel like a looming threat in the city. Out of all of the villains in this list, he's definitely one that doesn't actually seem overtly evil, but rather calculates all of his moves to be as perfect as possible. However, of the three chosen, I felt that he had the least on-screen connection to his god, and underneath the charisma and personal arcs in relation to Karlach, Gortash begins to feel overshadowed by other villains with deeper emotional weight. Where the other chosen are full of personality and tragic backstories respectively, Gortash lacks the emotional or grand in scale punch that makes the others the most memorable villains in the game. His fight also feels like the most underwhelming of the three, with no really unique mechanics or atmospheric allure that would make it stand out even amongst more minor boss fights in the game. Also, I found that other than his attempt to stop you at the Iron Throne, he doesn't really do too much to outplay you or manipulate you into submission, which is perplexing for a character with as much power and wit as him. To me, all of Gortash's emotional weight as a villain is tied to his manipulation and prior enslavement of Karlach, and it's definitely in these moments where his best traits shine. And again, his performance is undeniably one of the game's best, and while he may be the least compelling of the chosen three to me personally, his political presence and ties to Karlach's arc still earns him a spot in my top 5. The Emperor is a character not everyone would consider a villain, but that's of course dependent on the decisions that you take throughout the game. Revealing himself in Act 2's finale, the former Dream Guardian is revealed to be a powerful mind flayer who's been guiding you since the game's earlier sections. This twist is for sure one of the best in the game, with the idea that the being who helped you resist the Absolute is actually an Illithid itself. The Emperor surely has intrigue to his motivations, and the deep exposition he provides you of himself and the greater threat at hand can make him an ally if you stay consistently loyal to his desires. However, by turning on him, the Emperor may show his true colors, much of which you might have already seen in the quest involving Ansel. To me, this is where the Emperor's traits shine the most, as his betrayal of Ansel the Dragon and the ensuing reveal of being Baldur himself is the best twist in the entire game. The morally grey nature of the Emperor also adds to his character, and his consistent manipulation of you and your party to submit to his desires even if they are for the greater good makes him the most unique example on this list. However, not everything the Emperor has to offer is great. His very late reveal might feel cheap to some, and it sometimes feels like the game spends too much time spent in his exposition and reveal rather than letting you actually feel the impact of your choice to follow him blindly thus far. Also, for a character who literally lives in your mind and claims to be the only one who truly understands you, the Emperor also lacks emotional weight other than the side quest involving him and Answer, which makes him fall just short of the top 3 for me. Overall though, the Emperor is a great villain with strong voice acting and a lingering mystery that's never completely solved, making you always invested in his every action throughout your journey in the game. Now entering the top 3 entries in my list, at the 3rd place we've got none other than Auron the Red herself. Out of anyone in this list, Auron is the villain who makes the greatest first impression, and that's not only because of the buckets of blood she always seems to be bathing in. As the chosen of Baal and the granddaughter of Saravok himself, her entire identity and personality is built around a constantly lingering bloodlust and the performance of murder as some sort of twisted art form. And to be completely honest, all of this is terrifyingly effective. The very first time that you and your character actually see her, she's immediately impersonating your companions and threatens one of their lives, instantly making her presence one that you just can't ignore. Auron is without a doubt twisted, theatrical, and completely unpredictable, and in a game with larger than life stakes, Auron almost feels more personal, as she's more interested in taking a stab at you than truly serving a greater agenda. This is because unlike Ketheric or Gortash, Auron isn't trying to control Baldur's Gate or raise an army of devout followers, but she wants you to kill for her and embrace the dark and blood-soaked path of her god Baal. What makes her so unnerving is her complete obedience to Baal and her complete lack of any resonant emotions. Her battles with you aren't just physical, but they're psychological. She toys with your mind and threatens those close to you, even kidnapping one of them, which makes her feel more dangerous than some of the game's quote more powerful villains. One thing I'm not a fan of though is her boss fight. Yes, the atmosphere and the emotional stakes of it in regard to your kidnapped companion is definitely all there, but the actual mechanics and difficulty of the boss fight fall flat even if it's your first time playing through the game. This complaint is one that I also brushed upon in my Gortash section, and it's honestly in part due to the fact that by how late in the game these fights are, your build is certainly cemented, and your familiarity with the combat makes these fights an absolute breeze. However, they definitely could have made these a little more difficult or even more interesting in terms of mechanics, but to be honest, that's a minor complaint overall. To sum it all up, what really sets Auron apart is the way she almost feels comically evil, as unlike many of the more witful villains in this list, Auron doesn't want to rule the world, but she wants to rip it to shreds with a smile. In a game full of masterminds and conquerors, it's this very defining chaos of her character that makes her stand out, which firmly earns her place in the top 3. Ketheric Thorm is undoubtedly to me the most tragic and complex villain in the entire game. He isn't some sadistic killer or scheming politician like his counterparts in the Chosen 3, but he's a broken man who's irrevocably been twisted by grief and undying faith. From the moment that you enter Act 2, Ketheric's presence looms large over the Shadow-Cursed lands, both literally and emotionally. In a way, it feels like his grief itself covers the land, cursing all within it to the same damnation that he suffered. He's the first of the Chosen that you see, and the storytelling around him in particular is for sure nothing short of brilliant. He's not simply introduced as a monster, but a grieving father who wants his daughter back and lost his way while trying to bargain with dark powers that were never his. His deal and servitude with Merkel is what allows him to command the undead, and his transformation into an immortal tyrant after turning away from Selûne doesn't feel like comical or pure evil, but a desperation that changed him to his very core. Once a follower of Selûne, then to Shah, and then to Merkel, Ketheric displays a sort of desperation that's unlike any other character in the game. To add on, what makes Ketheric such a standout as a villain is personally how his emotional angst is weaved into the gameplay and environments of Act 2 itself. The attack on Moonrise Towers is one of the most epic and climactic encounters in the game, and out of all the Chosen, he definitely has the best boss fight. His boss fight is one of the rare multi-phase ones in the game, first atop Moonrise Towers itself, before descending into a final confrontation in a Mind Flayer colony. The final fight with Ketheric is not only grand in scale and in the narrative, but it directly impacts the very fate of his daughter and the lingering curse that envelopes the land around you. By his end, you don't just feel like you're killing a monster, but you actually try to understand him, and his death is not a moment of revenge, but rather a clarity of what Ketheric was. Unlike his counterparts Gortash and Auron, Ketheric isn't a manipulator or a megalomaniac. He's a man who did unforgivable things because he just couldn't let go, and that truly makes him the most human villain in all of Baldur's Gate 3. If you've watched any other video of mine, this is hardly a surprise. Raphael is my favorite character and villain in the entire game, and for very good reason. No villain in this game is as stylish, charismatic, or memorable as Raphael. From his very first appearance in Act 1, Raphael oozes charm and performance with every poetic word that he utters, and he lets you know from the get-go that he isn't just another devil. Raphael doesn't want to kill you, but instead he offers you a supposed ticket to salvation. This idea of salvation rings with you throughout Act 1, and Raphael makes sure you're aware of it both in his small appearance in Act 2 and of course in his significant role in Act 3 of the game. Unlike many other villains in this list like Auron, he doesn't outright try to kill you or even psychologically attack you, but he puts a wrapped fruit of salvation on a platter and encourages you to take a bite. Sometimes his offer seems tempting as you think to yourself, maybe he really is trying to help you, but Raphael shows flickers of a darker and more devilish persona, but one that he tries to keep under wraps at all times. When you finally infiltrate his House of Hope in hopes of finding the Orphic Hammer, Raphael's true cunning colors are put on full display. His House of Hope screams a sadistic agony that's been wrapped in a sort of tidiness that he tries to keep to, an order that he swears by even in your final dialogue with him. The House of Hope is without a doubt for me the most atmospheric location in the game, from the Lost Wandering Souls to his museum of rare and powerful artifacts. Raphael's palace is just as performative and dramatic as he is. It's a dungeon wrapped in elegance, reflecting the theatrical nature of Raphael himself. One of the greatest aspects about Raphael is for sure his final boss fight, and honestly him singing his own theme cemented his place in this list a long time ago. Raphael is so full of himself, so egotistical that he won't even let the game sing his theme song and rather does it himself, full Disney style. Raphael stands apart amongst all the villains in this list because he's really much more than just a simple villain. He's a symbol of temptation of the deals that we almost make, and whether or not you want in his salvation, he haunts your playthrough with his presence lingering in every single act of the game. He might not have the tragedy of Ketheric or the comical evil of Orin, but Raphael is greater than all of that, and is for sure the most unforgettable villain in the entire game. And that wraps up my personal ranking of the villains in Baldur's Gate 3. I really enjoyed making this video, and I would love to hear what your personal rankings are down below. It was a little bit of a tough one to make as the game has so many incredible villains throughout its runtime, and all of them truly offer their own unique flavor to the overall experience of Baldur's Gate 3. But anyway, that's all from me for today's video. If you did enjoy, please consider subbing to the channel for more Baldur's Gate 3 and RPG content, and I'll see you all in the next one. Peace.